12:03 a.m., lighting up the phone screen in a dark, quiet house. At first, it felt unreal, like one of those automated reminders that accidentally fires at the wrong time. But the subject line made it impossible to ignore. It was a violation notice from the HOA, timestamped just minutes earlier, claiming that a rule had been broken and that a fine had already been issued. There was something immediately unsettling about it. The neighborhood had been silent for hours. No cars moving, no lights switching on, no late-night inspections, at least none that had ever been announced or approved. And yet the notice insisted that a violation had been observed, documented, reviewed, and approved for penalty, all while most of the community was asleep. At first, the assumption was simple error. HOAs were notorious for sloppy administration, outdated systems, and automated tools that misfired. But as the message was read more carefully, the details began to feel off. The violation description was oddly specific, claiming an issue that would have required someone to physically be on the property, looking closely and documenting it with visual confirmation. The timestamp claimed this happened just before midnight. That alone raised questions. The HOA had strict rules about inspection hours, clearly outlined in its own governing documents. Inspections were permitted only during daytime hours and only on weekdays. Midnight inspections were not just unusual, they were explicitly prohibited. That detail had been buried in a section most homeowners never bothered to read, but it was there. Sleep was no longer an option. The more the notice was reviewed, the more inconsistencies appeared. The system-generated footer showed that the notice had been processed and finalized in under 3 minutes. That meant observation, documentation, internal review, and fine approval all supposedly occurred faster than it would take to log into the system. It felt less like enforcement and more like something preloaded and triggered. The next morning brought daylight but no clarity. Walking the property revealed nothing new. Nothing changed from the previous day, week, or even month. Whatever the alleged violation was, it had not suddenly appeared at midnight. That suggested the issue wasn't timing of the violation, but timing of the notice. Curiosity shifted into something sharper. Instead of responding emotionally or filing an immediate appeal, attention turned toward documentation. Every HOA action left a paper trail, even if the board preferred residents not to notice it. The online portal where fines were listed included metadata that most users ignored. Date fields, status changes, log entries. It was all there, quietly stored. The violation entry showed something interesting. While the notification email claimed the violation was observed just before midnight, the internal system log showed an earlier draft entry created days before. The status had remained inactive, unassigned, and incomplete. Then, suddenly, at 12:01 a.m., it flipped through multiple stages almost instantly. Observed, approved, fined, closed. That sequence alone was strange. HOA processes were usually slow, dragging on for weeks. Yet this one had sprinted through every step in minutes. It looked less like organic enforcement and more like a switch being flipped. Digging deeper revealed more. The system tracked which administrator account made changes. The same account had initiated the draft days earlier and finalized it at midnight. That account belonged to a board member known for being particularly aggressive with enforcement, someone who had recently lost a vote during a heated HOA meeting over budget reallocations. That context mattered. The property had been vocal during that meeting, openly criticizing how fines were being used as revenue instead of compliance tools. The disagreement had been public, documented, and uncomfortable for the board. At the time, it felt resolved or at least buried under procedural politeness. But now, with a midnight fine appearing out of nowhere, it felt less coincidental. Instead of confronting anyone directly, the focus turned to patterns. This wasn't about one fine anymore. It was about whether this had happened before. Using public HOA records, older violation notices were reviewed. Time after time, certain fines shared the same characteristics. Late-night timestamps.
Rapid processing.
The same administrator account. The same small group of targeted homeowners, most of whom had previously challenged the board in some way. What initially looked like incompetence began to resemble something more deliberate. The timestamps weren't just odd. They were strategically chosen. Midnight created plausible deniability. Few people checked emails at that hour. Fines could be processed and locked in before anyone noticed, making appeals harder and timelines tighter. The HOA bylaws included strict deadlines for contesting violations. The clock started at the moment a notice was issued, not when it was read. A midnight notice effectively shaved an entire day off the response window. That wasn't an accident. It was an advantage. Screenshots were taken. Logs were exported. PDFs were saved in multiple locations. Every timestamp, every status change, every administrator ID was preserved. This wasn't about anger anymore. It was about evidence. The next step was understanding how the system worked. The HOA had recently upgraded to a new management platform, one that allowed manual timestamp overrides for administrative purposes. That feature was meant for data migration and corrections, not enforcement. But it existed, and in the wrong hands it could be abused. The platform's user manual, publicly available online, explained exactly how timestamps could be edited, when logs were created, and which actions left permanent records. According to the documentation, while display timestamps could be modified, back-end logs could not. That meant the truth was still there, buried under the surface. That realization changed everything. The midnight fine wasn't just suspicious. It was sloppy. Whoever had done it assumed no one would look this closely. They assumed compliance through confusion and fatigue. They assumed homeowners wouldn't challenge a system that seemed official and final. But this time, the system had been watched. By the end of the day, a full timeline had been reconstructed. Draft creation date, modification times, finalization moment, notification trigger. Every step contradicted the story the HOA was presenting. The violation had not been observed at midnight. It had been resurrected, edited, and pushed through when no one was paying attention. The question was no longer whether the fine was valid. The question was how many others were like it, and what would happen when this pattern was exposed. The first chapter of the story ended not with confrontation, but with preparation. Everything was documented. Everything was backed up. And everything was ready to be presented not just to the HOA, but to an audience that understood exactly how power operated in small, quiet neighborhoods. The next step would not be private. And that was where things were about to change. With the evidence secured and organized, the situation shifted from personal frustration to something much larger. This was no longer just about a single fine or a single homeowner. The deeper the timeline was examined, the clearer it became that the midnight notice was part of a broader pattern, one that relied on obscurity, intimidation, and the assumption that no one would ever connect the dots. The HOA prided itself on efficiency and professionalism. On the surface, everything looked clean. Emails were formatted perfectly. Notices used official language. The portal displayed neat summaries and polished violation descriptions. But beneath that surface, the raw data told a different story. Every administrative action left behind digital footprints, and those footprints were beginning to form a trail that led straight back to the board itself. The timeline reconstruction started with one simple question. When had the alleged violation actually occurred? According to the notice, it was observed minutes before midnight. But the system logs contradicted that claim. The original draft entry, untouched for days, showed that the issue had been identified earlier in the week. It had sat idle, incomplete, and unresolved. No follow-up, no inspection photos added, no escalation. Then, suddenly, everything happened at once. Within a span of less than 2 minutes, the draft became an official violation. Approval was granted. Fine was issued. The case was closed. That sequence violated the HOA's own enforcement policy, which required review periods, warnings, and homeowner notification before penalties. None of that had occurred. The more this sequence was reviewed, the more it resembled a manufactured event rather than a legitimate process. It wasn't just rushed. It was artificially compressed. Someone had taken advantage of system permissions to push it through before anyone could intervene or question it. The next step was comparison. Other violations were examined side by side. especially those involving homeowners who had previously disagreed with the board. The similarities were impossible to ignore. The same administrative account, the same late-night processing times, the same lack of warning notices, the same rapid-fire approvals. It painted a picture of selective enforcement, not random error. What made it worse was the board's public stance. During meetings, they emphasized fairness, transparency, and consistency. They claimed the system was automated and impartial. But the logs showed manual intervention at every critical step. Automation hadn't issued these fines. People had. The realization was unsettling. This wasn't negligence. It was intentional. Instead of escalating immediately, the decision was made to let the HOA act first. A formal appeal was submitted through the portal, carefully written and unemotional. It referenced the bylaws, inspection hour restrictions, and the discrepancies between the notice and the system logs. Screenshots were attached. Dates were highlighted. No accusations were made, only questions. The response came faster than expected. Within hours, the violation status changed from closed to under review. That alone was telling. If the fine had truly been valid, there would have been no reason to reopen it. The board would have simply upheld it. Instead, the system activity spiked. Multiple administrators accessed the file. Edits were attempted. Metadata changed, but the back-end logs remained untouched. Each attempt to adjust the visible timeline only made the situation worse. New timestamps appeared that conflicted with old ones. The story the HOA was trying to present became increasingly inconsistent. It was like watching someone rewrite history in real time, unaware that the original version was permanently archived. At the same time, something else happened. Other homeowners began to notice changes to their own violation histories. Old fines disappeared. Statuses were updated. Notices were quietly withdrawn. It looked like damage control. That reaction confirmed everything. If this had been an isolated error, there would have been no need for widespread edits. The board wasn't correcting a mistake. It was cleaning up a mess. Public records requests were filed next. HOA governance documents required transparency for enforcement actions, and those records were legally accessible to members. Inspection schedules, administrator access logs, policy update histories, everything that could support or contradict the official narrative was requested. The documents arrived in batches. Some were incomplete. Some were heavily redacted. But even the redactions told a story. Dates were obscured. Names were removed. Entire sections were missing. The board was trying to control what could be seen, but they couldn't hide the gaps. One particularly revealing document showed that the administrative account responsible for the midnight fine had elevated permissions temporarily granted by a board vote months earlier. Those permissions allowed timestamp overrides and manual case closures. The vote had been justified as a system maintenance necessity. There was no mention of enforcement use. That was the key. Those permissions were never meant to be used this way. And yet, they had been used repeatedly, always benefiting the board and disadvantaging homeowners who pushed back. The appeal response finally arrived. The fine was conditionally waived, with no admission of error. The HOA claimed the notice had been sent due to a system irregularity and assured that no policy violations occurred. It was a carefully worded statement designed to close the issue quietly. But it did the opposite. Waiving the fine without explanation only validated the concerns. If the violation had been real, it would have been enforced. If the process had been sound, it would have been defended. Instead, the board chose silence. That silence became the loudest confirmation of all. By this point, the story had grown beyond a single homeowner. The evidence suggested a pattern of retaliation disguised as enforcement. A system designed to ensure order had been twisted into a tool for control. The question now was how to bring this into the open without letting it get buried again. The answer lay in sunlight. Everything was organized into a single, coherent timeline. Screenshots, logs, policy excerpts, public records. It wasn't presented as an attack, but as documentation. Facts laid out in chronological order, impossible to dismiss as coincidence. The decision was made to share it, Not in a private email, not behind closed doors, but in a way the entire community could see. Transparency was the HOA's favorite word. Now it was time to test whether they actually believed in it.as the materials were prepared for release. The board began to sense something was coming. Emergency meetings were scheduled. Notices were sent. Policies were suddenly updated. But it was too late. The timeline already existed. And once a timeline is exposed, it can't be rewritten. The second chapter ended with everything ready to go public. The only question left was how the HOA would react when the entire neighborhood saw what had really been happening after midnight. The release happened quietly at first. No dramatic announcement. No accusatory language. Just a single, organized post shared through the community's official homeowner forum, accompanied by supporting documents and a clear, chronological breakdown of events. It was labeled simply as a timeline review, framed as a transparency effort rather than a confrontation. That restraint made it impossible to dismiss. Within minutes, views climbed. Within hours, comments multiplied. Homeowners who had never questioned the HOA before began recognizing familiar patterns. Midnight notices, shortened appeal windows, fines that appeared without warning and vanished without explanation. The timeline didn't just tell one story. It unlocked dozens of others. What made the post powerful wasn't outrage. It was clarity. Each step was laid out in neutral language. Draft creation dates, modification timestamps, administrative access logs, policy excerpts showing inspection hour restrictions, screenshots showing how display timestamps differed from back-end logs. Nothing editorialized, nothing exaggerated, just facts arranged in an order that made denial increasingly difficult. The board's first reaction was silence. That silence lasted less than a day. Suddenly, official announcements appeared. The HOA claimed it was conducting an internal audit. Residents were assured that enforcement procedures were being reviewed for compliance. The language was vague, carefully constructed to sound proactive without admitting fault. But behind the scenes, activity spiked. Administrative logs showed frantic movement. Permissions were changed. Access levels were revoked. The very features that had enabled timestamp manipulation were quietly disabled. What had once been justified as a maintenance necessity was now treated as a liability. Homeowners noticed. The forum post continued to grow, now supplemented by additional documentation submitted by other residents. People began sharing their own records, screenshots, and saved emails. Patterns emerged not just in timing, but in targeting. Those who had questioned budgets, challenged decisions, or spoken up in meetings appeared disproportionately represented in the Midnight Fine Group. The board attempted to regain control by calling a special meeting. The agenda promised transparency and resolution. But the damage had already been done. The timeline had shifted the power dynamic. For the first time, the HOA was reacting instead of directing. During the days leading up to the meeting, more changes occurred. Old violations were retroactively marked as administrative errors. Fines were refunded without explanation. Entire enforcement categories were suspended. Each action, meant to calm the situation, only reinforced the idea that the system had been misused. If nothing had been wrong, there would have been nothing to undo. The meeting itself became a turning point, even without direct confrontation. Attendance was higher than it had been in years. Homeowners came prepared, not with emotional arguments, but with printed timelines and highlighted policy sections. The board's usual strategy, deflect, delay, and procedural jargon, fell flat against documented evidence. What stood out most was what the board didn't say. There was no denial that timestamps had been edited, no explanation for midnight processing, no justification for bypassing warning requirements. Instead, the narrative shifted toward moving forward and restoring trust. It was an implicit admission without the legal risk of explicit acknowledgement. By the end of the meeting, a decision was announced. A third-party audit would be conducted. Enforcement powers would be temporarily limited. All fines issued during the affected period would be reviewed. The administrative account at the center of the issue would no longer have elevated permissions. None of that would have happened without the timeline. In the weeks that followed, the effects rippled outward. The audit confirmed irregularities, though its language was cautious. It cited process deviations and inadequate oversight, but the conclusion was clear enough. The HOA had failed to follow its own rules. Board members resigned quietly. Others chose not to run for re-election. New candidates emerged, many of them homeowners who had previously stayed silent. The culture of enforcement shifted from aggressive to procedural. Notices were issued during business hours. Warnings were documented. Appeal windows were respected. The midnight fines stopped completely. What lingered, however, was the lesson. Power in these communities didn't come from authority alone. It came from complexity, from systems people didn't understand and therefore didn't question. The moment someone took the time to read the logs, check the manuals, and reconstruct the timeline, that power weakened. The original fine was long gone, refunded and erased from the record. But it no longer mattered. Its purpose had changed. It had become evidence, a catalyst that exposed how easily a system could be bent when no one was watching. The HOA continued to exist, as it always would. But it was different now. Meetings were better attended. Records were requested more often. Questions were asked earlier. Transparency became less of a slogan and more of a demand. And every time a notice went out, someone checked the timestamp. The story ended not with revenge, but with accountability. Not with shouting, but with documentation. A single midnight notification had revealed a quiet truth. That even the smallest acts of authority leave trails, and those trails, once followed, can change everything. That was the real consequence of checking the timeline. Because once people know how to look, the dark stops being a place where things can hide.